I still remember the arithmetic of scarcity. In the early 1980s, my family, and every family I knew, lived by rationed food coupons. Eggs, cooking oil, sugar, meat, cloth, soap. Little rectangles that decided what a household could taste, wash with, or wear. We cooked on coal-burning stoves. Electric power was unreliable enough that blackouts felt routine, even in Beijing. And when you walked down Chang'an Avenue, you saw a handful of cars trying to navigate an endless tide of bicycles that parted and rejoined like fish in a fast river. A few years later, those coupons would fade into memory. By the early 1990s, imported snacks were suddenly everywhere, and when the first McDonald's opened near Wangfujing, the queue ran for blocks. Happy Meals were still a luxury in my house, something you earned, not something you expected. I kept one of those coupons, a small rectangle for cooking oil, dated 1983. The paper has yellowed. The state seal has faded. But I still take it out sometimes because it reminds me that abundance was not inevitable. That is why I get uneasy when 1978 is reduced to a clean ideological slogan. The easy story goes like this. China was socialist, then it discovered capitalism. It was closed, then it opened. The state retreated, the market advanced. Convenient, familiar, and, no, let me say it more directly, wrong. What happened in and after 1978 was less an ideological conversion than an institutional rewiring. China began constructing a hybrid economy, one where state guidance and market mechanisms coexist in a tense partnership, and where the government remains an active participant in industrial strategy rather than a distant referee. If you want a metaphor for that year, don't picture a country swapping labels on a door. Picture a nation rewiring a massive circuit board while the lights are still on. 1978 mattered because it altered three things at once: incentives, authority, and imagination. It opened space for experimentation without demanding a reckless leap into the unknown. It offered the promise of improvement without insisting that every legacy wire be torn out overnight. The results weren't abstract. Between 1978 and 2011, China's average GDP growth was around 10%, and you could see the effects in the physical landscape. New buildings, new roads, new rail, new bridges, a country visibly reassembled in steel and concrete. Numbers like these can feel clinical, so let me pause, because behind them are households choosing risk over caution, local officials turning ambition into policy, and millions of people discovering that effort could finally translate into reward. Incentives changed everything. The first decade of reform focused on agriculture because hunger is the most unforgiving form of feedback. The logic was pragmatism, not purity. The state relaxed collective constraints and introduced household-level responsibility in practical, stepwise ways that allowed families to benefit from higher productivity. You could call that marketization. You could also call it socialism learning to breathe. Then the experiments moved coastward and outward. In the early to mid-1980s, the government launched a second wave of reforms by creating special economic zones. The privileges were exceptional and deliberately contained. Tax exemptions, reduced customs duties, cheaper land, and more flexible negotiations over labor and finance. Foreign firms brought technology and know-how. China offered low costs and an enormous market. The success of Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen built enough confidence that by 1984, similar programs expanded to 14 more cities. The rhythm was quietly revolutionary. Pilot, observe, expand, correct, repeat. This is one of the most misunderstood features of China's rise. Many outside observers treat the post-1978 miracle as a simple story of cheap labor and relentless investment. Those mattered, yes, but the deeper achievement was, wait, I want to phrase this carefully. It was the construction of a system that could revise itself without collapsing. Adaptability became a policy. The real innovation wasn't just opening a door to global capital. It was building a hallway of adjustable length. And the most fascinating part of that hallway was how China learned to manage contradiction. A market track grew alongside the planned one. Managers gained autonomy without a total surrender of political oversight. Some state firms were restructured, listed, merged, or closed, but gradually, in a way that tried to preserve social stability. Even the taboo language shifted. By 1994, after privatization had been politically unthinkable only a decade earlier, the private sector was already generating roughly 40% of urban employment. Today, it provides around 80% of jobs for the urban labor force. Read that again. The state remained powerful. The private sector became essential. That balance is not a slogan. It is a moving frontier. To understand why that frontier moved as far as it did, you have to appreciate something that looks technical but is actually political. China's starting configuration of power. China entered the reform era with strong state capacity but comparatively weaker formal institutions. Advanced economies like the United States, by contrast, have long benefited from stronger formal institutions even as aspects of state capacity have frayed. This asymmetry shaped what kinds of reforms were feasible and how quickly they could be executed. That is also why the hybrid economy always carries tension. Markets create discovery and discipline. States create coordination and scale. Markets can energize education, investment, and innovation. States can mobilize resources for national priorities. But markets, without robust guardrails, can veer into disorder. And states, without competitive pressure, can veer into complacency. China's post-1978 design tried to harvest the upsides of both logics while containing the dangers of each. It was never a fairy tale. It was a negotiated truce. Now let's move from the national wiring diagram to the local junction boxes. Because if you want one concept that explains why 1978 became a long era rather than a short episode, it's the system of local incentives that emerged in its wake. I call this the mayor economy. Local leaders in China often act as builders of markets and promoters of firms. Their careers and reputations are tied to measurable outcomes. Growth brings fiscal resources and local prestige. Employment brings political stability. Signature projects bring visibility. Under this system, local governments not only promote their own state enterprises, but also actively support private firms. In the early years, when private companies were tolerated but still carried the stigma of capitalism, officials sometimes dressed them up as collective enterprises, giving them red hats while they conducted normal business. As private enterprise proved its effectiveness, local governments shifted from reluctant tolerance to active courtship, offering tax breaks and flexible regulations in competitive beauty contests for investment. This is messy. It involves patronage. It invites local protectionism. It can reward excess. But it is also a form of developmental improvisation that matched China's institutional reality. A vivid example is Kunshan, which reinvented itself as a niche market for Taiwanese investors. The local government offered business-friendly policies, streamlined licensing, land leases, fiscal support, and a strict anti-corruption stance. The result was an investment boom and the creation of thousands of new companies. Systems grow in the dirt. This local dynamism helps you reinterpret the consumer scenes I described earlier. The fast food queue at Wangfujing was not the cause of reform. It was a cultural signal that the current was flowing. And the Shanghai wave of the 1990s, the plunge into private business, was not just a labor market shift. It was a psychological rewrite of what a good life could mean, with new rewards, new risks, and new forms of status. This is where many narratives stop, because the images are vivid and the moral is tempting. China became capitalist. But that conclusion misses another crucial wire installed in 1978: finance. Until the late 1970s, China's modern financial system was rudimentary. Beyond the Bank of China, the People's Bank of China dominated the landscape and served both central and commercial functions. Only in 1978 did China begin to build a modern banking system by spinning off commercial banks from the PBC, institutions that evolved into the core state-owned giants that still shape credit allocation. This sounds like a footnote. It isn't, because it illustrates a defining feature of the hybrid design. The financial system was assigned strategic tasks from the start, supporting industrialization, infrastructure, and even ailing state firms the government was reluctant to liquidate. That architecture can mobilize capital at extraordinary speed. It can also plant distortions that surface later, especially when growth becomes credit-dependent. This has a price. Now, if you want to see the deeper genius of the post-1978 operating system, look at how later reforms echoed the same logic of calibrated change rather than destructive rupture. The late 1990s state-owned enterprise reforms show this clearly. A large portion of SOEs were unprofitable. The response was not a big bang sell-off. It was a more surgical strategy, consolidating and strengthening the largest firms while allowing smaller ones to be dissolved or restructured. Between 1995 and 2002, roughly 44 million workers were laid off from state-owned enterprises. 44 million. Entire factory towns hollowed out. Families who had trusted the iron rice bowl woke up to discover it had cracked. Older workers, people in their 40s and 50s who had given their whole careers to state firms, found themselves too young to retire and too old to retrain. Some never recovered. Productivity and profitability improved markedly in the early 2000s. The statistics looked better. The balance sheets stabilized. The surgery was declared a success. Why bring this into a story about 1978? Because 1978 created the political and philosophical permission slip for pragmatism. Once a country accepts that effective outcomes can be as legitimate as ideological purity, later upgrades become possible. This is the operating system logic again. And this is the moment where I want to share something that lived in the margins of my writing process, a quieter conclusion that I didn't have space to fully unpack. Many readers focus on specific policies, the zones, the pricing reforms, the evolution of private enterprise, the cautious reshaping of the state sector. For me, the unspoken heart of 1978 is trust. Not sentimental trust, institutional trust. The reforms gradually taught households that extra effort could yield extra reward. They taught entrepreneurs that risk-taking could be politically survivable, even if it had to be disguised under a red hat at first. They taught local officials that their personal advancement could be aligned with measurable prosperity. And they taught the central state that decentralizing discovery did not automatically mean losing command. That is a four-sided contract. You can visualize it as a new wiring diagram with four terminals: the center, the locality, the firm, and the family. When all four terminals carry current, growth can feel unstoppable. When one terminal shorts, the entire circuit becomes vulnerable. This is why the story of 1978 is not just a historical triumph. It is a living challenge, because the easy part of growth, moving from scarcity to basic abundance, has largely been achieved. The next phase demands harder balances: equality and incentives, security and dynamism, self-reliance and engagement with global markets. The easy part is over. So when you hear contemporary debates about China's direction, resist the temptation to interpret every shift as proof of a permanent turn toward either liberal capitalism or rigid statism. The pendulum can swing. Policy environments can tighten and loosen. But what is too often missed is the deeper inertia of lived experience. Decades of reform have changed expectations, habits, and interests. Too many people, including newer generations of leaders, have become beneficiaries of reform for a wholesale reversal to be effortless. Here is the harder truth that most analyses of China's rise never quite land on. Every successful developmental state eventually faces a question it cannot answer with more development. The question is not, how do we grow, but what was the growth for? Japan faced it, South Korea faced it, and China is facing it now. Perhaps more acutely because the scale is unprecedented and because the social contract was never written down. 1978 promised that tomorrow would be materially better than today. For 4 decades, that promise was kept spectacularly well. But a promise of perpetual improvement is also a trap. It works until it doesn't. And when growth slows, as it must, as it does in every maturing economy, what remains? The reformers of 1978 were brilliant engineers. They rewired a nation. But engineering cannot answer the question of meaning. That is a different kind of work, and it has barely begun. Now let me land this where I started, because a good story should return you to something you can feel. I can still see those coupons. I can still smell the coal smoke. I can still picture the bicycles on Chang'an Avenue. I can still remember the strange, almost magical feeling of abundance arriving without permission. Those are not just personal memories. They are the texture of a transformation that statistics cannot capture. I still have that oil coupon from 1983. The paper is brittle now. The ink has faded to the color of weak tea. My daughter asked me once why I keep it. I told her, because it reminds me that the world we live in was not given. It was built. By decisions, by gambles, by millions of people who woke up one morning and discovered that the rules had quietly changed. And because it reminds me that what was built can also be unbuilt. The circuit is still live, the current is still flowing. But circuits, I have learned, require maintenance. And maintenance requires remembering what the wiring was for.